Terror, cold and absolute, coiled in Cale's stomach. It was a terror so profound it stole the air from his lungs and locked his joints, freezing him in place. He stood in a chamber so vast it seemed to have its own horizon, a cavern of impossible geometry that hummed with an energy that felt wrong. The silence here was a physical thing, a 10,000-year-old weight pressing down on him. But the silence was breaking. Before him, the vault of the Silent King, a sheer cliff face of seamless, impossible obsidian, was groaning. It wasn't the sound of metal on stone. It was the sound of mountains shattering, of a tectonic plate giving way. A single, hairline crack had appeared, spiderwebbing up from the floor, a fracture in a material that galactic law deemed unbreakable. And from it, something wept. It wasn't light. It was anti-light. A pure, black energy, a void-black tear in the fabric of reality, sizzled as it seeped from the wound. It dripped onto the floor, and the ancient, alien alloy dissolved beneath it, hissing into nothingness. Cale's hand trembled, not from the cold, but from the horrifying, soul-crushing realization. He had done this. His gaze fell to his trembling hand. A small, crumpled piece of silver foil, a standard issue, military ration pack, now empty, slipped from his nerveless fingers. It fell to the floor with a pathetic, metallic tink, a sound that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the vast, groaning chamber. He had broken the one, sacred, 10,000-year-old rule. And for what? A simple, human, act of pity? Could that be enough to end a galaxy? As if in answer, the temple itself screamed. A klaxon, ancient and primal, blasted from the walls, so loud it shook the dust from the air. It was an alarm that had not been heard since the dawn of the Empire, a warning that had become a myth. A synthesized voice, frantic and godlike, boomed from the very air around him, a signal now blazing across every known frequency, rattling every fleet, every colony, every homeworld. Alert! Alert! Cale shut his eyes, the empty ration pack lying at his feet like a judge's gavel. Containment breach imminent. The groaning of the vault rose to a deafening roar. Protocol Maw is broken. 6 months before the end of everything, there was only the silence. Ethelberg was a planet of dust and regrets. It was the galaxy's forgotten attic, a speck of rock orbiting a dying red star, notable for nothing except the one, massive structure that squatted on its equator, the tomb of the Silent King. And Cale was its sole guardian. The title, Disgraced Exemplar, was a cruel, bureaucratic joke. A permanent, living reminder of his wound. Cale was a good soldier. He was, perhaps, too good a soldier, just a bad human. Or was it the other way around? The memory haunted him every time he polished the tomb's outer plaques, a language he couldn't read, for a king he'd never seen. It was the Kirin uprising. He was on the bridge of the destroyer arbitration. The tactical display was a swarm of red icons. The order had been cold, logical, and absolute. Target the refugee vessel. It is providing shield cover for the warlord's flagship. Fire on command. Cale had looked through the high-res viewfinder. He saw the ship. A repurposed freighter, pitted and leaking atmosphere. But his scanners, more sensitive than the fleet's standard, picked up the heat signatures inside. Thousands of them. Small. Too small. Fire, exemplar. He couldn't. His hand wouldn't obey. His illogical, primitive human empathy, as the tribunal later called it, took over. He didn't just hesitate. He refused. He diverted power, breaking protocol, and fired a tractor beam warning shot that physically shoved the refugee ship out of the firing line. The warlord's flagship, its cover blown, had jumped to hyperspace. It escaped. His humanity had compromised galactic security. So they sent him here. To this religious duty. A punishment designed to make him invisible. He was a ghost haunting a graveyard. No ships came. No calms were answered. His only companion was the high, thin shriek of the wind over the black, alien architecture of the tomb. A tomb that, Cale was beginning to suspect, was not a tomb at all. It felt wrong. It hummed, a low-frequency vibration he could feel in his teeth. It was a machine, dormant and cold, but a machine nonetheless. What kind of king needed to be buried in a power station? His only rule, the one carved into the great, sealed archway of the inner sanctum, was clear. Maintain the edifice. Never break the seal. Let the king sleep. Kale, haunted by the ghosts of the children he had saved, and now guardian to a king he was ordered to never see, ran a hand along the cold, seamless door. He was a man broken by his own compassion. And he was very, very alone. What, he wondered, could possibly be worse than this silence? His day began not with the sun, for Ethelberg's star was a dim, red smear in the bruised purple sky, but with the hum. It was a sound that wasn't a sound. It was a vibration, a subsonic thrum that vibrated in his teeth and in the marrow of his bones. The hum was the only proof that the tomb of the silent king was not a tomb at all. It was a machine. Kale's daily routine was a ritual of maintenance and haunted silence. He was a good soldier. Disgrace hadn't changed that. His duty was to the outer edifices. At 0600, he'd suit up and walk the perimeter, calibrating the atmospheric scrubbers that kept the toxic, rust-colored dust from eating the sacred, black onyx walls. The architecture was impossible. The angles were wrong, designed to catch the meager light in a way that made the structure seem to fold in on itself. It was a place of cold, alien geometry, and Kale had come to match it. That human part of him, the weakness that had cost him his career? He'd walled it up. Buried it. Here, there was no one to save. Here, there was only the hum. It wasn't the hum of power on. It was the hum of power held back. The sound of a star being forced into a bottle. He would finish his patrol at the great archway leading to the inner sanctum. It was sealed. It had been sealed for 10 millennia. And etched into its surface, in the shimmering, unreadable hieratics of the empire, was the single law he lived by. The vow he was exiled to uphold. Maintain the edifice. He did. The outer walls were pristine. Never break the seal. He hadn't. He never would. Let the king sleep. He would. He would run his gloved hand over the script, feeling the alien cold of it. 1,000,000 tons of alien alloy, forgotten faith, and something that felt disturbingly like fear. What kind of being needed a door like that, just to sleep? It was a question he'd learned to stop asking. Asking questions was what got him here. He finished his patrol and returned to his small, gray monitoring station. He sat, the hum a constant, oppressive companion. It was the planet's heartbeat. Steady. Unchanging. Eternal. He prepared his sterile, flavorless ration paste. The hum was his clock. His calendar. His warden. And then, for the first time in his 6-month exile, the hum stuttered. It was a skip. A jarring, fractional pause in the 10,000-year-old rhythm, like a heart missing a beat. Kale froze, his spoon halfway to his lips. The silence that rushed in was more terrifying than any alarm. In 6 months, the hum had never, ever changed. Until now. The skip beat was a precursor. A warning shot. The real event came 7 seconds later. It wasn't a sound. It was a silent, invisible scream of radiation that washed over the dead planet. The proximity alert on Kale's console didn't even have time to finish its warning before the gamma ray burst. A ripple from a star death 1,000 light-years away hit them. The sky in the viewport flashed a sickening, inverted green. Every light in Kale's monitoring station didn't just flicker. They exploded in a shower of sparks and superheated glass. And the hum died. It wasn't a fade. It was a severance. The 10,000-year-old heartbeat of Ethelberg flatlined. Kale was thrown from his chair as the station plunged into emergency red lighting and a total, suffocating silence. A silence more terrifying, more absolute, than the hum had ever been. "VI!" he yelled, his voice sounding small and dead in the unmoving air. "Status!" No reply. The VI was fried. Then, a new light flickered in the sudden dark. It came from the far wall. from a panel Kale had assumed was just decorative, part of the tomb's alien architecture. It glowed, not with human tech, but with the shimmering, unreadable hieratics of the vow itself. It was a console he'd never known was functional. The script glowed, shifted, and then, chillingly, translated into standard galactic text. It was a single, stark red line blinking in the dark. Error, internal power manifold. Offline. Kale's blood ran cold. The tomb wasn't just dormant. It was broken. System integrity, 14%. 13%. His military training snapped into place over the rising panic. He was a guardian. He was a soldier. His duty was to maintain. Computer, he said to the new console. Locate access port for internal power manifold. The alien console hummed, and a schematic flashed onto the screen. It was a map of the inner sanctum. The port, the one place he could manually reboot the system and stop that critical percentage from dropping to zero, was deep inside. It was located at the very base of the great, sealed, obsidian vault. Kale stood, his heart hammering in the new, dead silence. He looked at the blinking red warning. 12%. He looked at the sealed archway of the inner sanctum. Maintain the edifice. The machine was dying. His duty was to fix it. Never break the seal. The fix was inside the seal. It was the ultimate soldier's nightmare. A perfect, logical trap. What does a good soldier do when the only way to obey is to disobey? 11%. Kale grabbed his override tool. He ran for the door. The vow broke with the sound of a dying star. Kale jammed the override tool into the 10,000-year-old seam of the archway. The tool whined, a high-pitched, desperate sound against the unmoving alloy. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a crack like a glacier calving, the seal fractured. A puff of dead, sterile air, untouched by any living lung for 100 centuries, washed over him. System integrity, 8%. He plunged into the dark. The inner sanctum was not a tomb. It was a machine. A cold, cavernous, and utterly still machine room. The air itself felt dead, a sucking cold that stole the heat from his body. Massive, dormant conduits, thick as star freighters, lined the walls, all leading to one, impossible, dominant feature. The vault. It was so much bigger from the inside. A sheer, black cliff of seamless, light-devouring obsidian that rose until it vanished into the artificial darkness above. His wristcom lit the path, guiding him toward the manifold port at its base. His boots echoed, a sacrilegious sound in the ancient silence. He was a virus in a sealed system. He found the port, a simple, glowing interface, just as his comm blinked, 7%. He reached for it. And froze. His flashlight beam had caught something. A movement. He swung the light back, his heart hammering. "Who's there?" His voice was a dry croak. At first, he thought they were part of the machine. Two small, grotesque shapes huddled in the shadows, almost welded to the vault's base. Then he moved the light closer. And his humanity, his flaw, shattered his soldiers' discipline. They were children. Or at least they had the shape of children. They were skeletal, their limbs like brittle, black twigs, huddled on all fours like starving animals. They were silent. No cry, no whimper. Just a terrifying, animal stillness. And they were chained. Not with metal. They were bound by flickering, sickly yellow energy tethers, a dozen of them, plugged directly from the vault's base into their frail bodies. The tethers were failing, flickering in time with the station's dying power. Kale took one step closer, and they looked up. He stumbled back, a gasp of pure, primal horror catching in his throat. Their eyes. They were gone. There was nothing in their heads but two enormous, lightless pits of hunger. It wasn't the hunger of a missed meal. It was a 10,000-year-old starvation, an emptiness so profound it felt like a gravity well, pulling at his very soul. 6%. The mission, the vow, the blinking red light, it all vanished. The tribunal's voice in his head, "You compromised galactic security," was drowned out by a single, human, undebatable truth. They're alive. And they're in pain. That illogical, primitive empathy that had cost him his life, it didn't just override his discipline. It consumed it. The reboot forgotten, Kale slowly, very slowly, unclipped a silver foil packet from his belt. His own emergency ration. He had fixed it. Back in his sterile monitoring station, the hum had returned, steady and absolute. The gamma ray burst had passed. The internal power manifold was back online. Kale had done his duty. He had maintained the edifice. But the edifice was no longer the problem. He couldn't close his eyes. Every time he did, he saw them. The two skeletal shapes. The flickering, sickly yellow tethers. And the eyes. Those black pits of unending, 10,000-year-old starvation. His flaw, his cursed, illogical, human empathy, was screaming at him. He had fixed the machine, but he had left the children to starve. He sat for an hour, the hum vibrating in his teeth, his soldier's discipline at war with his human soul. The tribunal's voice echoed in his memory. Compromised galactic security. But a new, louder voice echoed over it. They're in pain. The soldier lost. The human won. Breaking the vow a second time felt different. The first time was for duty. This time, this was a transgression. This was choice. He grabbed a standard issue, high-nutrient paste from his locker. He unsealed the inner sanctum. The air was cold and dead, as before. The great obsidian vault was silent, the hum its only heartbeat. He approached the twins. They were exactly as he'd left them, huddled and still. They made no sound, but he could feel their terror. He knelt, his movements slow, as if approaching a cornered, wounded animal. He cracked the seal on the ration paste. The smell of nutrient-rich food hit the dead air. It was the first, living, thing to enter this chamber in 10 millennia. The twins recoiled. They hissed, a dry, papery sound scrambling back against the vault wall, their energy tethers stretching. They were terrified. Not of him. Of the food. It's okay, Kale whispered, his voice a betrayal of the tomb's silence. It's just food. It's for you. He held it out. The starvation, the ancient, primal need, finally overwhelmed their terror. One of them, its form impossibly thin, lunged. It wasn't a taking. It was a strike. It snatched the packet from his hand with a desperate, animalistic speed and shoved the paste into its mouth, devouring it in a single, convulsive motion. The second it was metabolized, the entire planet groaned. It wasn't a quake. It was a sound. A deep, resonant thrum, as if a god had cleared its throat. The great, obsidian vault shuddered, and the energy tethers chaining the twins to the wall didn't just flicker, they flared, turning from a sickly yellow to a vibrant, angry gold. The other twin, seeing this, lunged for his belt, clawing for another packet. Kale scrambled back, heart pounding. What had he done? He fled the sanctum, sealing the vow behind him. He collapsed into his monitoring chair, panting. And his eyes snapped to the console. A light, one he had long ignored, was flashing. It was a small, amber light on the tomb status panel. For 6 months, it had been a steady, dull red. The label under the red light read, Containment status, nominal. Now, it was no longer red. It was flashing a bright, insistent amber. And the amber light read, Containment status, fluctuating. The fluctuating, amber light became Kale's new warden. It was a pulsing, digital accusation on the tomb status panel. Every throb was a reminder, you broke the vow. You changed the equation. The nominal, red was gone, replaced by the sickly, uncertain amber. The soldier in him, the part that still craved order and discipline, screamed at him to stop. To let the machine be. To obey the 10,000-year-old law. But the man in him, the flawed, empathetic human, could only see those black, bottomless eyes. The hunger. His humanity, his wound, was stronger than his discipline. He couldn't stop. It became a ritual, a dark, daily confession. Every night at 2300 Kale falsified his own supply logs, a petty crime that felt more transgressive than breaking the sacred vow. He would steal 2 high-nutrient ration packs, his hands shaking, and slip into the cold, dead air of the inner sanctum. The first few times, the twins were feral, lunging at the food with that desperate, animalistic speed. But the ritual was changing them. With every feeding, the consequences escalated. The moment the nutrient paste was metabolized, the great obsidian vault would ring. Not a groan, but a single, resonant bong, like a vast, black bell had been struck, a sound that shook Kale's very bones. The tremors followed. At first, they were just shudders. By the 3rd week, they were full-blown quakes. Dust, undisturbed for millennia, would rain from the high, invisible ceiling. The fluctuating, amber light on his console would pulse faster now, a frantic, digital heartbeat. Kale told himself he was saving them. That this was the right thing to do. That this was compassion. But the twins were the real mystery. They were no longer skeletal. The food was fuel. Their skin, once frail and translucent, was thickening, hardening into an iridescent, onyx-like carapace, the exact same material as the vault itself. They were stronger. But it was their eyes that truly haunted him. The black, feral pits of pure, animal need were gone. Now, when Kale entered, they didn't lunge. They waited. They stood side by side, their energy tethers flaring gold, and they watched him. Their feral gaze had been replaced by a terrifying, cold, and ancient awareness. It was the look of a genius waking up. On the 30th day, he placed the rations on the floor and began to back away. They didn't move for the food. They just stared at him. Then, in perfect, chilling unison, they tilted their heads, a synchronized, analytical gesture. Kale scrambled out, sealing the vow behind him. He was a man in a cold sweat, finally forced to ask the question his compassion had been screaming over. He told himself he was rescuing them. But what if he wasn't? What, exactly, was he feeding? And what, in the name of all the gods, was he feeding them for? The planetary quakes were no longer jarring events. They had become the new normal. Weeks of the ritual had passed, and the hum, the original, steady, 10,000-year-old hum, was gone. In its place was this new, constant, low-frequency vibration. It was a grinding, grating thrum, as if a colossal, subterranean engine was slowly, painfully, building up to full power. Kale, driven by that same, flawed empathy that had cost him his career, interpreted this new, grinding vibration as healing. The proof was right in front of him. The children were transforming. The nutrient paste, that simple, human-made food, had done its work. But the result wasn't healthy. It was alien. Their skeletal frames were gone, filled out with a sleek, dense musculature that seemed to ripple with latent energy. Their skin, once frail and translucent, was now a shimmering, iridescent carapace. It was a deep, onyx-like black, and Kale, to his growing unease, realized it was the exact same material as the great, light-devouring vault itself. They were no longer chained, starving animals. They were forged. But the physical change was nothing compared to the behavioral one. They no longer huddled. They no longer snatched at the food. When Kale entered the sanctum, they stood. They were nearly at his full height now. And they watched. That terrifying, animal need in their black, pit-like eyes was gone. It had been replaced by an intelligence that was ancient, analytical, and colder than the tomb itself. They watched him, their heads tilting in that same, chilling, perfect synchronicity. They weren't curious. They were studying. Kale, in his profound, human loneliness, chose to see this as progress. He was civilizing them. He was, in his own mind, a savior. He was finally, truly, protecting the vulnerable. He had to believe he was their rescuer. Because the alternative was simply unthinkable. He entered for the 57th day feeding. The grinding thrum of the planet was so loud now, he could feel it in his molars. He set down the 2 ration packs at the usual spot. The twins stood watching him, their new, onyx skin shimmering in the beam of his wrist light. He backed away, as he always did. "Eat," he said, his voice sounding small. It's good." They didn't look at the food. They didn't look at him. In perfect unison they both turned. They faced the great, black, seamless obsidian vault. They stood before it, silent and still. Then, one of them raised its hand. It wasn't a wave. It wasn't a threat. It was one long, hardened, onyx-like finger. And it was pointing. Not just at the vault. It was pointing at a specific, empty spot on the seamless, unbreakable, 10-millennia-old door. It was pointing exactly where Cale had seen the crack, in the vision that had not yet happened. This was the pivot. The moment the universe bent and broke. It was the 61st day. The grinding, planet-wide thrum was so loud now that Cale had to wear sonic dampeners in his own quarters. He entered the inner sanctum, the 2 nutrient packs feeling heavy in his hand, like a bribe. The twins were already standing. The air around them was different. It was shimmering, as if buckling under an intense, invisible heat. And the yellow energy tethers that had chained them to the vault? They were gone. Not broken. Not retracted. Absorbed. Cale's blood, which had been running cold for weeks, now turned to ice. He had a sudden, sick feeling. He wasn't feeding them. He was fueling them. He followed the ritual, his movements now automatic. He placed the 2 ration packs on the cold floor. "Eat," he said, his voice a dry croak. "It's time." And for the first time, they refused. They didn't move. They didn't look at the food. They didn't even look at him. The ritual was broken. The thing he had built, the one purpose he had found in his exile, it was over. They no longer needed him. The planet's deafening, grinding thrum stopped. The silence that rushed in was absolute, a crushing, terrifying void, like the split second before a lightning strike. Cale was no longer their savior. He was irrelevant. In that perfect, chilling unison, they both turned. They faced the great, black, seamless obsidian vault. They stood before it, silent, radiant, and waiting. A new terror, a sickness of why, gripped Cale. Was it compassion? He wondered, his mind racing. Or was it just arrogance? Had he, a disgraced, broken man, truly believed he could save something tied to a machine this size? He fumbled for the exit, just as a new light caught his eye. Back in his monitoring station, the console, his one link to this place, was flashing. The amber, fluctuating, light stopped blinking. It held steady, then pulsed once, twice, and turned a brilliant, blinding, sickly green. The label beneath it, once nominal and then fluctuating, now read a word that Cale had never seen. Containment status, active. Active, he whispered. The word was a command. The entire tomb blazed to life. The dormant conduits on the walls, thick as star freighters, lit up with a black internal energy, the same anti-light he'd seen in the crack. The planet didn't just quake. It screamed. A high-pitched, metallic shriek that Cale felt in his skull, a sound of metal tearing and reality itself coming apart at the seams. Then, the true alarm. The one from his nightmares. The synthesized, godlike voice from the cold open, so loud it cracked the console screen, boomed from the very air around him. Alert! Alert! He looked at the twins, now just 2 black silhouettes against the blazing, energy-filled vault. He finally understood. Amber hadn't meant unstable. It had meant priming. Green didn't mean fixed. It meant ready. Containment breach imminent. He hadn't been rescuing them. He had been arming them. Protocol MAW is broken. This was never a rescue. It was an activation. The MAW is broken. Alarm shrieked, echoing off the now living walls of the inner sanctum. The black energy thrummed. The 2 twins stood like onyx statues, silhouettes against the now active vault. Cale's mind, the disciplined, soldier's mind, was gone. In its place was a primal, human terror. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet, scrambling out of the sanctum, and slammed his hand on the emergency seal button. The great archway door groaned, and for the first time, Kale realized it wasn't a vow seal. It was a blast door. He fell back into his monitoring station, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The entire station was a symphony of alarms now, a flashing red hell. The containment alarm from the tomb was the basso note, but a new, frantic, staccato alarm had just joined it. A proximity alert. A ship? For a wild, desperate second, Kale's broken mind flashed to rescue. A supply run? Had the Empire not forgotten him? Had they heard the alarm and sent help? He scrambled to the main viewport, wiping the condensation from the plasteel. "Show me!" he yelled at the fried VI. He slapped the manual shutter release. The reinforced steel plates slid open. And Kale's blood, which he thought couldn't get any colder, turned to absolute zero. The bruised purple sky of Ethelberg was gone. It was blotted out by a wall of black steel. They weren't approaching. They were here. A dozen fractures in reality, still shimmering from their hyperspace jump, hung in low orbit. These weren't freighters. They weren't science vessels. They were Imperial arbitrators. Dagger-shaped, obsidian black, and bristling with spinal-mounted energy lances. They were cold, silent, and utterly without lights, like a fleet of sharks. Dozens of them. A full battle group. A war fleet. Kale's last, stupid ember of hope, rescue, was snuffed out. He stared at the lead vessel, the Judgment. It hung directly over the tomb, a miles-long blade of vengeance. His comms remained silent. They weren't hailing him. They weren't asking for a status report. This wasn't a response. This was a culling. This wasn't a supply run. As Kale watched, frozen, 100 weapon ports slid open, all aimed not at him, but at the tomb. They hadn't arrived because of the alarm. The alarm had just been the starting gun. They had been waiting. The station screamed as a concussion blast blew the main door off its hinges, sending it skittering across the room like a steel plate. Kale was already on his knees, hands raised, the trained reflex of a disgraced soldier. The red emergency lights flashed, catching the silhouettes of the figures pouring in. They were phantoms. Imperial arbitrators, 7 feet of polished, black composite armor and cold, reptilian certainty. They moved without sound, their weapons held in a low, ready stance. They fanned out, securing the tiny station in less than a second. Then he entered. Arbitrator General Forlag. He was magnificent and terrifying. His armor was a deeper, more ornate black, his multifaceted eyes glowing with a cold, blue light. He didn't run. He strode into the room, his presence sucking all the heat from the air. He radiated an authority so absolute it was a physical weight. He didn't even look at Kale. His cold, blue gaze snapped instantly to the monitoring console. To the single, flashing, green light. Containment status, active. "No," Forlag whispered. The word was a dry hiss, a sound of utter disbelief. He strode past Kale, his power-armored hand grabbing the rim of the sealed blast door to the inner sanctum. With a scream of tortured metal, he tore it back open. He stepped inside. And froze. The cold, arrogant, 7-foot-tall God General froze. He stood on the threshold of the sanctum, his phantoms flanking him, and for a full 5 seconds he did not move. He did not breathe. Kale, still on his knees, looked past him into the chamber. He saw what Forlag saw. The empty, silver-foil ration packs scattered across the floor like spent, metallic shell casings. And the twins. They were no longer cowering. They were standing tall as Kale himself. Their bodies, now a pure, polished onyx, were crackling with the same, terrifying, anti-light that now pulsed from the great vault. They were not children. They were avatars. Forlag's gaze, his multifaceted blue eyes, slowly moved from the twins, down to the rations. Then back to the twins. The logic, cold and absolute, clicked into place. The color drained from Forlag's gray, reptilian features. The certainty, the 10,000-year-old authority, didn't just crack. It shattered. It was replaced by a pure, unadulterated primal horror. This was the OSH*T realization. The moment a god sees the dagger already in its own heart. He turned, his movements stiff, robotic. He stared down at Kale. His voice wasn't the boom of a general. It was the high, thin scream of the truly, apocalyptically damned. What have you done? He pointed a single, trembling, black-armored finger at the empty foil wrappers. You. He choked on the word. You fed them? The accusation hung in the thrumming, dark air, a sentence of galactic treason. You primitive, sentimental fool! Forlag's accusation of fool hung in the thrumming, supercharged air. Kale, still on his knees, felt a sudden, hot surge of his old, defiant flaw. The same humanity that had cost him his career. They were starving! He yelled back, his voice cracking against the alien metal. They were children! They were chained! What kind of monster builds a temple, and chains children to it? Forlag's head snapped back. His multifaceted, blue-glowing eyes went wide, and he made a sound. It was a dry, reptilian laugh, a single, bark of pure, unadulterated terror. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked pitying. You truly don't know, do you? Forlag whispered. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a frantic, horrifying awe. You see suffering, and your first, primitive instinct is to stop it. You never ever stop to ask. Why? He jabbed a quaking, black-armored finger, not at Kale, but at the two twins, who stood silent and crackling with dark power. Those are not prisoners, you sentimental ape. The first twist landed, shattering Kale's entire reality. They are the locks. Kale's mind couldn't parse the word. Locks. They are the jailers. Forlag's voice was now a desperate, high-pitched wail, a frantic attempt to make the primitive understand the god-level physics he had just broken. They are ancient, symbiotic energy siphons. Their one purpose, their entire existence, was to contain the vault. Forlag was pacing now, his movements jerky, unsoldier-like. He was panicked. That hunger. He gestured wildly at the empty ration packs. That wasn't a flaw, you moron. That was their function. Kale was shaking his head, uncomprehending. That's torture. It's physics. Forlag screamed, his voice cracking. A lock needs a key. Their ritual, unending, 10,000-year-old starvation, that was the key. It's a state of perpetual energy drawdown. A failsafe. It's what kept the vault sealed. It's what kept the king asleep. Forlag's composure finally shattered. He strode forward and grabbed Kale by the tattered front of his uniform, hauling him to his feet. His cold, reptilian face was inches from Kale's, his multifaceted eyes blazing with a terrified, newfound hate. They were never, ever, meant to be fed. Kale looked past the general's shoulder. The two jailers were watching. They were listening. And as they heard their purpose explained, their cold, ancient, newly awakened faces smirked. They had been given a name. Jailers. And Kale had just given them a new purpose. Kale's mind was a white noise void. Jailers. He was stuck on the word, his reality fractured. Jailers for what? He's dead. The vow says let the king sleep. Forlag, his face a mask of apocalyptic despair, shoved Kale away, sending him sprawling to the floor. The general didn't even look at him. He stared at the vault, his plasma rifle held loosely at his side, a useless trinket against the truth. Sleep? Forlag's laugh was a dry, scraping sound, a hiss of pure nihilism. The euphemism of the 10,000-year lie. He raised his rifle, not at Kale, not at the twins, but at the vault. As if he could shoot a god. That isn't a tomb. He snarled, his voice dropping to a low, venomous, terrified hiss. It's a prison. The Silent King isn't dead, he's imprisoned. The second twist landed, and it was a killing blow. Kale's blood, which he thought was already ice, found a new, impossible, lower temperature. In prison. Who is in there that needs a planet as a cage? We call him the Silent King in our official logs. Forlag spat, his voice trembling. A religious duty to make the guards docile. To make you manageable. He paused, and the air thrummed. The black energy pulsed from the vault, a steady, waking heartbeat. But the old texts, the real texts, the ones that built this machine. His voice dropped to a whisper. They have a name for him. Valak. The name felt heavy. It felt wrong in the air, a word that devoured sound. Valak, the ruler of chaos. The father. Forlag finally turned, his multifaceted, blue eyes blazing with the galaxy's darkest, most well-kept secret. Why do you think we are the most powerful empire in the galaxy, you fool? Because our entire peaceful civilization, our fleets, our homeworlds, our shimmering spires, our very lives, have been a lie. He pointed at the thrumming vault. For 10 millennia, we have siphoned the leaked energy from that thing's cage. We are parasites. We built a paradise on the battery of a devil. Our peace is a theft. Forlag's voice rose back to that desperate, high-pitched scream. But the prison, the jailers, they were a closed system. They were animals. They were programmed. They had one drive, hunger. A drive that kept them containing. He whirled on Kale, his face a mask of ultimate, final blame. And you primitive, sentimental, human. You gave them food. But you didn't just give them nutrients. Forlag looked at the twins, who were watching him, learning. You gave them choice. You broke their 10,000-year-old programming. Kale stared at the two beings. They were no longer children. They were no longer jailers. They were liberated. One of them, the one that had refused the food, slowly turned its head. It looked away from Forlag, past Kale, and directly at the arbitrator phantoms guarding the door. It smiled. A cold, black, onyx-hard smile. It had just heard the name of its father. Forlag's terror, his panic, finally coalesced back into one, single, desperate act of military protocol. He was a general. He had lost control. His only remaining solution was to eradicate the variable. Fire! He screamed, his voice cracking, a desperate, pathetic sound. Eradicate them! Level the room! Now! The arbitrator phantoms were disciplined. They obeyed. A dozen plasma rifles, the most powerful hand weapons in the Imperial arsenal, snapped up. A volley of searing, blue-white energy, hot enough to melt starship armor, lanced across the sanctum. And stopped. The bolts didn't splash. They didn't ricochet. They didn't even hit. They froze in midair, a foot from the twins' bodies, a dozen miniature, raging, blue-white suns held in a grip of pure, invisible will. Forlag let out a small, strangled gasp. The twins didn't even flinch. They held their ground, and the plasma, drained. The blue-white energy was sucked into their black, onyx carapaces, like black holes drinking light. The raging bolts of death were consumed. It wasn't a weapon. It was food. Forlag's rifle slipped from his numb, black-armored fingers. It clattered, useless and pathetic, on the ancient, metal floor. His authority, his technology, his civilization, it was all irrelevant. It was sustenance. In perfect, chilling, deliberate unison, the twins turned. They ignored the general. They ignored the frozen, black-armored phantoms. They looked past the symbols of power, as if they were nothing more than furniture. They looked directly at Kale. He was still on the floor, a trembling, broken, human man, the lowest status being in the room. Kale clamped his hands over his ears, but it did nothing. The voice wasn't in the air. It was inside his mind. It was a sound of ancient stars grinding together, of shadows and ice, a plural echo that was everywhere at once. The father in the vault. The voice echoed in his skull. He fed us. He fed us purpose. He fed us hunger. His food was cold. The twins' black, pit-like eyes stared into Kale's. They weren't just looking at him. They were reading him. They were seeing his flaw, his empathy, his guilt, his Kirin uprising failure. And they didn't see weakness. They saw potential. You. The voice continued, a cold, alien gratitude rippling through it. Yours was kind. Yours was choice. Kale's mind reeled. Choice? He fed us starvation. The voice boomed, a declaration of galactic-level change. You fed us will. The twins took a single, synchronized step toward Kale. The arbitrator phantoms flinched, but they didn't fire. They knew it was useless. The twins were now standing over him. They looked down at the disgraced, broken, human soldier who, through a single, stupid, act of kindness, had just broken a 10,000-year-old prison. He is our jailer. He is our past. The two beings, now crackling with their own, new, dark power, tilted their heads. They were no longer asking. They were anointing. You are our father now. You are our father now. The anointing hung in the air, a sentence of pure, galactic-level doom. Kale's humanity, his flaw, had just been weaponized. Forlag, the God General, took a single, involuntary step back. His disciplined phantoms, useless and terrified, did the same. They were no longer jailers. They were witnesses. The twins, anointed and liberated by their new fathers, will turn their backs on the trembling, primitive man who had freed them. They were done with him. They were done with the arbitrators. In perfect, gliding unison, they turned to the great, black, obsidian vault. It was not their prison. It was their shrine. It was not their cage. It was their altar. They approached it not as prisoners, but as priests. They moved with a new, dark, godlike grace, their onyx bodies crackling with the raw, black energy of the thing inside. Kale watched, paralyzed. He was a ghost in his own horror story. His hand, the one that had held the first, stolen, high-nutrient ration, unclenched. A single, crumpled silver foil wrapper, the one from the cold open, the one he'd kept in his pocket as a symbol of his guilt, fell from his trembling fingers. It tinked on the floor. The sound was a trigger. The twins reached the vault. They raised their new, powerful, onyx-hard hands. And they pushed. There was no sound. At first. Then a groan. It was not the sound of metal. It was a tear. The sound of a 10,000-year-old seam in the fabric of reality finally giving way. The obsidian vault split. Kale didn't see light. He saw pressure. A wave of pure, silent, absolute black. It was not a void, it was an entity. A darkness so profound it felt solid. The wave of anti-light burst from the tomb. It didn't expand. It erupted. Kale was thrown from his feet, but his eyes were drawn, magnetically, to the viewport in his station. He watched the black energy, a plume of pure, silent nothing, rush up from the planet's surface. It touched the lead arbitrator vessel, the Judgment. The ship stopped. It didn't explode. It didn't burn. Its lights, its engines, its life signs, were simply snuffed out. One by one, like candles in a hurricane, the lights of the arbitrator war fleet went out, leaving only a graveyard of cold, dead hulls in orbit. Forlag, his armor useless, made a small, wet sound. The sound of a god general sobbing. Back in the tomb, the black energy receded, coiling back into the now open doorway. A shadow stood in the vault. It was vast. Formless. It had no shape, but it had weight. It was a hole in the universe. It rose, unfurling to its full, impossible height, a being of pure, destructive, ancient chaos. Valak, the ruler, the father, was free. And Kale's single, primitive, human act of compassion had just undone 1,000,000 years of peace.